episode of the High Ground powered by Premier podcast, and we have esteemed guest Glenn Longenball with us again from Land O'Lakes, regional agronomist for Premier Companies. And welcome aboard, Glenn, for another round of the podcast.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I think today we're going to kick off the conversation talking about nitrogen stabilizers. We'll jump into some high yield systems later, and I'll kick it over to co-host Sal for the first question for you.
Yeah, Ryan, we got to tell you, last week we tried our first teams meeting across, I think it was about 12 counties and lots of different devices. And the topics that we talked about with Glenn leading the conversation was nitrogen stabilizers. And now I think at any other point we want to make sure we make the most of the nitrogen we have and not lose any nitrogen to the environment. So Glenn, thanks for getting back with us. And I know we kind of touched on stink bugs and some other topics last time, but now can you tell us how to make the most of the nitrogen that we do apply on this corn crop? Because I'm guessing that a corn plant doesn't care what it costs per unit of nitrogen, does it?
That is true. It, there's a maximum uptake of nitrogen, and there's actually a removal of nitrogen. And if you saw those two numbers, they're pretty far apart, right? Oftentimes in our part of the world, the uptake of nitrogen is somewhere around a pound per bushel. Sometimes in our mineral soils, sometimes it makes no sense, but it'll actually be more than a pound per bushel. Lower yield environments, it'll be more than a pound per bushel. And yet, whenever you look at the removal, it's only about 6 or 7 tenths of a pound per bushel. And so the thing to know about nitrogen is this, guys, it's a leaky system. From the time we make a nitrogen application, there is nitrogen getting away from us. And so, different growers, manage nitrogen differently, right? There are those that are around the maximum economic return, right? It's like, I don't want to put any more on than what I'm going to see a positive response because I know there's this diminishing returns. There's others that it's about, we want the maximum agronomic return to nitrogen. And then there are those that are just really, it's more about logistics, right? It's I know I got to have nitrogen on. I farm X number of acres. I can only get over those one time. These really good acres, I can maybe get over twice. And so for them, it becomes almost more about logistics, right? And so everybody makes decisions about nitrogen differently. And yet, they all are leaky systems, right? Some of our high yield folks, right, within Premier, that go out and use irrigation to make regular applications of nitrogen can get, they can get their nitrogen per bushel of uptake. They can get that really refined down, but those folks that are trying to make single applications, oftentimes they have the most loss, right? Yeah. So how much you put on doesn't equate to how much loss you have. If you can put it on timely and by the way, that's another topic, right? Yeah. What is timely, right? The most timely way is to put it on just as the plant needs it, or just in front of when the plant needs it. So
it's kind of like was it Woody Hayes that said when you throw a pass, a lot of things can happen, and only one of them's good.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So when we apply nitrogen, a lot of things can happen, only one of them's good. So tell us about the, I guess in layman's terms this time. I've seen you do the nitrogen cycle several times. I can't repeat it. But tell us in layman's terms, what's the fate of nitrogen? And you said two things there. The removal, what we actually take out is a lot different than what it takes to grow the crop. So how do we keep the most nitrogen available for the corn plant? I know there's a lot of variables there with what kind of nitrogen source we use and the timing. But what are our tools? Sure. What are our tools that we have that we can keep the most nitrogen where it's supposed to be and in the form the plant likes?
Yeah, so some of those are cultural and some of those are maybe chemical, right? And so culturally, the tools that we use are using the right rate, the right time, putting it in the right place, which is down in the ground, not necessarily on the surface. And then lastly, it's about the right form. And that right form is always ammonium, NH4. Right. That's not what we put on when we put down ammonia. We're putting out NH3, and NH3 has that's ammonia. It has a really strong affinity for water. And almost as soon as you make that application, if there's any moisture in the soil, it converts to ammonium hydroxide. And that ammonium is really the form that we want to see in the soil. So if we make applications that either are that either immediately convert to ammonium or eventually convert to ammonium, right? So even urea and UAN applications will convert to ammonium, right? So urea is easily broken down by an enzyme, and that enzyme is called urease, and urease is found in all living things, and it's a way for nature to kind of mitigate urea and make it into other things that plants and animals can use, primarily ammonium, because ammonium kind of sounds a little bit like amino groups or amino acids. Well, an NH2 is an amino group or an amino group, and that's kind of one of the building blocks of life. And so that's why nitrogen is important. And, we could talk about the chemistry all day long, but ultimately it's this, right? We want to try to keep nitrogen in the ammonium form as long as we can. So anytime we use products that degrade quickly into ammonium, they have a habit of sticking around longer. If we, another cultural thing we can do is the timing, right? When you consider that pre-plant applications of nitrogen are often subjected to more than a month of weathering, right? So, a fourth of the season goes by when you have the most product on the ground on pre-plant applications. And guess what? You probably haven't taken up 20 or 25 pounds in that first month of uptake. And so when we make pre-plant applications, we really expose ourselves to lots and lots of nitrogen loss, right? That's probably the primary way to lose a bunch of nitrogen is go out and make pre-plant applications. So it's about using the right form. It's about using, putting out there at the right time. So ideally, I'd love to see growers either use a planter or use a weed and feed system to basically get nitrogen down, get some kind of a base down, and then come back and make a second application, whether that's a side dress or as Y drops, make this second application really your friend as far as loss, because those pre-plant applications are really subject to a lot of loss.
Yeah, and I like the way you put that, having it out there for 30 days, Ryan. I mean, that's a lot of things can happen in that time frame to be weathered out there. So putting it on in multiple applications, and I think most of the time you even recommend 3 applications, don't you? Kind of at planting time, 20 or a lower rate of planting, and then coming back with maybe some side dress or even some broadcast later.
Yeah, that's a great point. I would love to see 3 applications, but again, it becomes a exercise in logistics, right? Can you manage that? I know farms that are easy, right? They're rectangular. They have long rows. Those fields are easily managed for multiple applications. But you have other farms. You've heard me say that I've got a farm that's shaped like a squid that's mating with another squid. And, that farm is not conducive, right? When it's basically a bunch of hilltops that snake in and out, and they're wide and then they're narrow. That's not a farm that's conducive for top dress and certainly not side dress applications, right? Because you got so many point rows, you would end up running over more corn than you would be aiding. So in that case, we probably need to think about maybe broadcast top dress applications, maybe after emergence, but certainly before it gets into that stage where you can really damage a lot of corn. So I hate to make it sound so simple, right? That's what most technical experts do, is they make it just sound like it's just so simple, and it's really not, right? When you put that farmer hat on and it's your choice, and you're trying to decide, how do I navigate? How much do I put down early? How much do I come back and side dress with? Or how much do I put in a wide drop application? There's a lot of emotion, right? There is nothing more unsettling for a grower, right? Nothing more unsettling than not having your nitrogen on, having corn in a V5, V6 time frame, and having a wet forecast, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's nothing probably more emotional to a grower than that, because I can tell you that personally, I side dress, and I hate it every year until I get done. And when I get done, it's like, whew, man, I know of all the things I do, I probably made myself more pesos side dressing these applications than any other thing I do. But one of the things I have, we've talked about this temporal component. We've talked about using the right form and putting it in the ground as opposed to surface applications. But ultimately, there's another set of tools that oftentimes are considered maybe a little bit expensive, and that would be the fertilizer additives. And yet this year, those fertilizer additives look very reasonable, right? So when you're paying 30 to 35 cents a unit for nitrogen, like we were maybe in some previous years, then, spending $10 to $20 for a nitrogen stabilizer. I really don't know how much they cost, honestly. I don't have any kind of a pricing sheet in front of me, but they're relatively expensive. And in the past, it's like, wow, I could put on a lot of units for that, for that price tag, and especially if I split apply them. But today, I don't care what form you use, you're looking at $1 plus a unit. And so for our guys that are high, intensive managers, high management corn growers that are often way in excess of 200 pounds per acre, right? You take $1 a pound, and I don't care what form you use and how well you buy it, you're probably going to have, $225 to $275 an acre, right? It's going to be very expensive. And so then those what we have commonly referred to as stabilizers. They're not all stabilizers, but those products that we call stabilizers look a lot more reasonable, right? Because it only takes 10 to 15 pounds of loss to make a big dent in that fertilizer additive. And so fertilizer additives, before you even ask, let me break this down, right? There are two really camps of fertilizer additives. There are the additives that we put on when we make surface applications, right? So if we're making surface applications of urea or UAN, right, 28%, 32%, and we're putting them on top of the ground, and we're not planning on working those in, absolutely, positively, every time, right? Every one of those applications should have Agritane, Limas, some kind of a urease inhibitor, right? And there's several products on the market. If they contain NBPT or NPPT, right, then those products will keep urease at bay and keep them from converting from urea into ammonia at the surface. And the reason why that's important is if we don't stop that reaction at the surface, if urea converts to ammonia at the surface, guess what? It oftentimes, a large portion of it will not get bound with the water in the surface, but will actually volatilize, right? And go back into the atmosphere. And so that's a huge loss. And those losses could be, 25, 30% pretty easily if you have warm conditions and urease is active, and you can have a lot of loss there. So that's one camp of nitrogen stabilizers. They're called urease inhibitors. Think of the ones that we've traditionally used is Agritane or Anvol or super urea, right? That's the three products. There is another group of products, though, that work below ground. And those below ground products are basically exploiting, or they're screwing up a process we call nitrification, right? And so if we make an ammonia application or a urea application and we get it down into the ground and it converts to ammonium, which is the form that we want, ammonium stays put really, really well, but it does have a fate, and its fate is that it will degrade via a couple of different microbes into nitrate, right? The first of these microbes is called Nitrosomonas. The second is called Nitrobacter. And that process is called nitrification. You can slow nitrification. You don't normally stop nitrification. And so when we make below ground applications, right, as ammonium as ammonia or urea, it's going to convert to ammonium. And then we put Inserve or Instinct on those products to keep them as ammonium, because we can keep them as ammonium, they will stay eligible to be taken up by that plant for a long period of time. Now, nitrification itself isn't bad, because plants take up more nitrate, which is the fate of ammonium. They take up more nitrate than they do ammonium. But once it gets in that nitrate form, it is really eligible for loss, right? So nitrate is NO3 2-. It's negatively charged. 1-. It has a one extra electron. It's out of configuration. I know no one on here cares. You just need to know that it's negatively charged, so it's not held to the soil colloid.
Ryan is making notes as fast as he can. Right now. So he is.
I am so sorry. I tell you, this is a problem when you ask agronomists a question, right? We want to build you clocks, right? But nitrate has. You ask us what time it is, and we start building clocks, man. But so nitrate, it's NO3, it's 1-. Sulfate, right, is another common anion that plants need to take up, and it is SO4 2-, right? So it's really negatively charged. Neither one of which, right, is held closely to a soil colloid. And so if you get a big rainfall event after nitrification has taken place, that nitrate can easily go right out the bottom of your profile. It can end up in the groundwater. It can go out the field tiles and be in your surface water. Neither one of those are a huge environmental risk, but it's just costing us bunches and bunches of dollars. And then there's another loss, and that is, let's say we get a big rain event and it rains enough like we did in 2019 where the water actually stays ponded on the surface. When you have anaerobic conditions, there are microbes in the soil, not Nitrosomonas or Nitrobacter, but other microbes that can utilize the oxygen that's on nitrate to actually respire. And what they do is they'll basically use your nitrate as a substrate in these anaerobic or without air conditions, and they will give off nitrous oxide and nitric oxide, which are both greenhouse gases. So those are also bad for the environment. Whether it leaves the field in the air or whether it leaves the field out the tile line, it's an environmental hazard. And this is one of the reasons why we need to start adopting these other technologies, right? And I don't mean just fertilizer additives. I mean fertilizer additives, spoon feeding nitrogen, trying to make multiple applications per year, right? All of these things are good for the environment, and they're good for our wallet, right? But these fertilizer additives in the past, where growers thought, well, I think that's maybe a little high, man, fertilizer additives this year are going to be really, really inexpensive in comparison to the cost of nitrogen. I'm sorry to have belabored that.
No, I think that's important. One thing I would ask for you to explain to the listeners a little bit, we pull soil tests, and we're always looking for levels to which we would apply to. Nitrogen's a little different, and you've already referred to the pound per bushel, depending on the soil types we have, and mineral soils being different. And so that rule of thumb that we have, are there ways obviously you can tissue test a plant and you'll have some idea of that nitrogen, but that doesn't tell you anything about the available nitrogen in the soil or nitrogen that could still yet be converted. So you're sitting there thinking about a side dress pass, and you think, I wonder how many pounds I should put on. What is a good way, the best way potentially to know, how do I make that? I think I want to shoot for 220 bushel corn. I'm roughly thinking a pound per bushel. I've already got 180 on side dress. It's been wet. I mean, are there rules of thumb that I can go out there without saying, well, it's been a little wet, I need 40 additional pounds, I ought to put 60 on? You just talked about environmental impacts of losing nitrates and sulfates. You've talked about the fact that some of it will just get away from us, so we just can't get it. Ultimately, anything that doesn't go into plant, environmental or not, it is expensive. How do we find out and make an educated guess on what our next pass should be?
Wow, Ryan, what an open-ended question, and I hope you guys have another 45 minutes.
Start building the clock.
yeah, there you go. There's your springs in your hands. Build the clock.
Yeah, you know what? I'm gonna simplify this. First of all, you need to know that if we could model, or we could had a soil test that we could easily judge how much nitrogen is going to be available to a plant, then we wouldn't have given away as many PhDs as we have in nitrogen management, right? So you take the last 40 years, and universities have probably had more PhDs earned on different parts of the, managing nitrogen than any other topic. And in reality, we're back at almost the exact same values, right? Other than now we don't take a soybean credit, where we used to take a soybean credit, but had a bigger, we had a bigger number for how many pounds it took per bushel, but then we'd take this soybean nitrogen credit. In reality, right, all the PhDs were earned, all the insights, all the models, and we're back to using almost exactly the same amounts that we used in the 70s, right? I mean, the numbers have not changed much, but I think there are some tools that you can use. First of all, you can take soil samples and you have to send them to a lab, right? And then you'll get what's called you'll ask for both ammonium and nitrate, right? A lot of folks, right, are using nitrate tests to maybe manage nitrogen. The problem with nitrate tests is that's only a portion of the equation, right? Nitrate tests tell you how much was converted into nitrate. They don't tell you how much is in reserve as ammonium. So if you want a real quantitative figure of how much you have in reserves and eligible to be taken up, you have to have both numbers, right? And so you send that sample to SureTech, and they're going to send it back in parts per million. And then you need to know how deep you sampled. But I still think there's a fair amount of licking your finger and sticking it in the air, right? With that system. You can take tissue samples, right, to get insights on, how much nitrogen is actually in the plant. It doesn't tell you how much is in the soil, but it tells you if maybe you've been limited on the plant. Ultimately, I tell you, there are a couple of pretty good models out there. One of them is Climate has a pretty good model. And the one that's probably the single most thorough model out there is called FET. And that's a wind field model. Now, it's terribly time consuming to put numbers into, but oftentimes you can get a wind field person to, put the numbers in on a given soil. I mean, it's specific to a given farm, but oftentimes you can put the metrics in for a farm, and then you can extrapolate those results, right? Because if it's wet, if it's wet in the southern part of the county, it's probably wet at Lagodi too, right? So you could very easily extrapolate that data and say, hey, I think I've lost a lot. So again, you've got modeling, you have sampling, whether that's tissue or soil, but there is no wonderful one way to really manage nitrogen in season, right? It does become a little bit more art than science, right?
Okay.
Does that make sense?
It certainly does. And
I can tell you, by the way, I can tell you why that is, right? We've earned all these PhDs because the nitrogen cycle is so crazy complex, right? Simultaneously at any one time, right? We have nitrification taking place. We have denitrification. We have leaching. We have mineralization, right? We have fixation from legumes. We have fixation from the atmosphere with lightning storms. So you have all of these metrics taking place simultaneously, right? And so you're not solving, right? There's some people that think, oh, we can fix that with math. Well, I got news for you. It's pretty easy for people that are good with, calculus or algebra to solve for one variable or maybe even 2 or 3 variables. But when you start talking about a half a dozen variables at a time, it becomes very, very difficult. That's the reason why this becomes, more of a dart throwing contest than it is an exact. But these models like FET or climate do a pretty decent job of helping you forecast what you've lost. But sorry that was so belabored.
No, but it's just interesting that we end up where we started. We get back to, we've done a lot of work over the years, and we came back to where we were in the early 90s or even in the 70s, and that's trying to shoot for a pound per bushel of yield goal. So, but Glenn, I think you've really taken us through the nitrogen cycle, and we've got those nitrogen stabilizer products, whether it's above ground or below ground at Premier Ag. And if you have further questions, Premier Ag, just talk with your account manager and ask them about the benefits and of stabilizing nitrogen. And Glenn, we're going to have you back on the high ground for another podcast and talk about another topic, tar spot, which was very prevalent last year and causing a lot of heartache going into 2022 and anxiety. So
sure.
Ryan, do you have anything else for Glenn?
Nope. I appreciate it. I've got full page of notes here, so I'm ready to make nitrogen recommendations.
All right. Thanks
Very
again,
good.
Glenn.
Thanks, Glenn.
No, thanks, guys.